In a windswept English village where stones remember more than men, Sir Aldric has spent 15 years guarding nothing but regret. The aging knight tends his crumbling manor alone, his sword gathering dust while winter storms batter the coast. Tonight, the tempest brings something unexpected. A figure collapsed beneath his garden archway, clutching a worn satchel like a lifeline. She is soaked to the bone, shivering, clearly destitute. Every instinct tells him to bar the door, to protect what little peace he's built in solitude. Instead, something stirs in his chest, an echo of the man he once was. "Come inside now," he calls through the howling wind, his voice carrying both command and compassion. But what happens when a single act of mercy between two broken souls becomes something neither planned for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman's eyes fluttered open to the crackle of flames and the scent of burning oak. Eleanor found herself wrapped in coarse wool blankets, her sodden clothes replaced by a man's linen shirt that hung past her knees. The fever that had gripped her during the storm seemed to have broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She lay on a worn leather couch positioned near a massive stone fireplace, its mantle adorned with a single artifact that caught her attention, a battle-worn sword, its blade nicked and pommel worn smooth by countless hands. The great hall around her spoke of faded grandeur. Tapestries hung in tatters from stone walls, their once vibrant colors muted by decades of neglect. Dust motes danced in shafts of gray, light filtering through diamond-paned windows, some cracked, others boarded over entirely. The floor, once polished stone, now bore the grime of years and the careless passage of a man who had ceased to care about appearances. Sir Aldric emerged from what she assumed was the kitchen, carrying a wooden tray bearing a clay bowl and a chunk of dark bread. He moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to solitude, each step measured, deliberate. His hair, more silver than brown, hung past his shoulders in a way that suggested he cut it himself with little concern. For fashion, lines etched deep around his green eyes spoke of both laughter and sorrow, though Eleanor suspected it had been some time since the former. "You should eat," he said, setting the tray on a low table beside her. His voice carried the educated tones of nobility, though roughened by years of disuse in conversation. "The fever took much from you." Eleanor struggled to sit upright, her pride warring with her obvious weakness. "I should not have imposed upon your kindness, my lord. If you could, but point me toward the village. In this weather, you'd not make it past the garden gate." Aldric settled into a high-backed chair across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "The storm shows no sign of breaking. You're welcome to shelter here until it passes." She studied his face, searching for the ulterior motives that experience had taught her to expect from men. Instead, she found only a careful politeness, as if he were as uncertain about this situation as she. "I fear I have little to offer in return for your generosity." "I ask for nothing." The words came quickly, almost defensively. "Eat, rest. The storm will pass." Eleanor lifted the bowl with trembling hands, surprised to find the broth rich and well-seasoned. As she ate, she let her gaze wander the hall, noting details that spoke of a man's long isolation. No feminine touches softened the harsh angles of furniture. Dust gathered in corners where no servant's broom had reached. Books lay open on various surfaces, abandoned mid-reading, suggesting a mind that jumped from one thought to another without the anchor of human conversation. "This is a beautiful home," she offered, though the word beautiful required considerable charity given its current state. Aldric's laugh held no humor. "Beautiful once, perhaps. Now it serves its purpose, 4 walls and a roof against the weather. You live here alone?" 15 years now." He stood abruptly, moving to adjust a log in the fire, though it needed no adjustment. "My apologies, Should have introduced myself properly. Sir Aldric Thornwick, though the title means little these days. Eleanor, she replied softly. Eleanor Hartwell. The surname felt strange on her tongue, a reminder of a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. You were a knight in service to the crown? Once. The word carried the weight of a door slamming shut. Long ago. Eleanor sensed the pain beneath his brevity and chose not to press. She understood the desire to bury certain chapters of one's life so deeply that they might never see daylight again. Instead, she finished her broth in silence, watching him. From beneath lowered lashes, Sir Aldric moved through his domain like a ghost haunting familiar rooms. She noticed how he avoided certain areas. A doorway to the left remained firmly closed, and his eyes never lingered on a portrait hanging near. The main staircase, though dust outlined where other paintings had once hung beside it. This was a man editing his own history, removing pieces that brought too much pain to bear. When she set down the empty bowl, he returned to collect the tray. There's a chamber upstairs where you can rest properly. Clean clothes they belonged. To double quotes. He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. They should fit well enough. Eleanor rose slowly, testing her strength. The world swayed only slightly, a vast improvement from the previous night's delirium. You're very kind, Sir Aldric. I promise I'll not burden you longer than necessary. No burden, he said, though she caught the slight hesitation that suggested. Otherwise, this place has known too much silence. As she followed him up the worn stone steps, Eleanor noticed more signs of deliberate neglect. Family portraits turned to face the walls. Doors sealed with what appeared to be wax. A man's attempt to make his own home forget what it had once been. The chamber he led her to surprised her with its careful preparation. Someone Aldric himself, she realized, had aired the room, changed the linens, and left a selection of women's clothing folded neatly on the bed. The garments were well made but dated, as if they had waited long years for someone to claim them. The storm should break by tomorrow evening, Aldric said, lingering in the doorway. Rest as long as you need. After he left, Eleanor examined the clothes more closely. They belonged to a woman of similar height and build, suggesting Aldric had once shared this home with someone who mattered deeply to him. The fabric held the faint scent of lavender and something else, the particular mustiness that comes from years of careful storage, as if these garments were precious relics rather than mere clothing. She chose a simple wool dress in deep blue, finding it fitted her remarkably well. As she braided her still damp hair, Eleanor caught sight of herself in a tarnished mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The fever had hollowed her cheeks, and her eyes held a wariness that spoke of recent trauma. She looked like what she was, a woman fleeing something terrible. That evening, Aldric prepared a simple supper of bread, cheese, and preserved meat. They ate at a massive oak table that could have seated 20, the empty chairs around them like silent witnesses to gatherings long past. Eleanor found herself studying her host's hands as he cut the bread, scarred but steady, the hands of a man who had known both sword work and manual labor. You mentioned you were traveling, Aldric said, breaking the comfortable silence. May I ask your destination? Eleanor's fingers tightened around her cup of watered wine. North. Perhaps Scotland. I have distant relations there. The lie came easily, born of necessity. In truth, she had no destination beyond away from London, away from creditors, away from the life that had crumbled around her like a house of cards. But she could hardly burden this kind stranger with such a sordid tale. A long journey for a woman traveling alone, Aldric observed, though his tone held no judgment. Sometimes, distance is the only cure for certain ailments of the heart. He nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. Yes, I found geography can be therapeutic. They finished their meal in companionable quiet, each lost in thoughts they were not ready to share. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the manor's ancient stones. But within these walls, Eleanor felt something she had not experienced. In months safety dot, as she prepared to retire, Eleanor paused at the foot of the stairs. "Sir Aldric, thank you. Not just for the shelter, but for asking no questions." "We all carry burdens we'd rather not name," he replied. "Sleep well, Eleanor." She climbed the stairs feeling lighter than she had in weeks, not knowing that downstairs, Aldric stood staring into the dying fire, wondering what force had delivered this woman to his door, and whether he possessed the strength to let her leave when the storm passed. Eleanor woke to silence. The storm's fury had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a particular stillness that follows violent weather. Pale morning light filtered through the chamber windows, revealing a world washed clean but changed. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes, her own garments now dry but bearing the permanent stains of her desperate flight through this countryside. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman transformed by a night's proper rest, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of deeper exhaustion that sleep alone could not cure. She gathered her few possessions, a worn leather satchel, a thin purse containing her last few coins, and a letter she wished she had the courage to destroy. Downstairs, she found Aldric stoking the fire, though the morning air hardly required additional warmth. He looked up at her approach, and she saw something flicker across his features. Disappointment, perhaps, at her obvious preparation to leave. "The storm has passed," she said unnecessarily. "So it has." He straightened, brushing ash from his hands. "I've prepared some provisions for your journey. Bread, dried meat, a skin of water." Eleanor's throat tightened at his thoughtfulness. "You're too generous, Sir Aldric. I fear I've already imposed far too much upon your kindness." Nonsense. Any decent person would have done the same. But Eleanor knew better. In her months of flight from London, she had encountered precious few decent people willing to aid. A woman traveling alone with nothing to offer in return. Most had looked upon her with suspicion, others with predatory interest. Aldric's simple mercy shone all the brighter for its rarity. As she moved to collect her satchel, the worn leather strap finally succumbed to the abuse it had endured. The bag tumbled to the floor, spilling its meager contents across the stone. Eleanor dropped to her knees, frantically gathering her possessions, but Aldric was quicker. His hand closed around the letter that had fallen from an inner pocket, the water-damaged correspondence that had become both her burden and her guide. "My apologies," he said, extending the letter toward her. But as she reached for it, his eyes caught the official seal, still partially visible despite the water damage. "This bears the mark of the London courts." Eleanor's face went white. The letter trembled in her hands as she pressed it against her chest. "It's nothing of consequence, Eleanor." Aldric's voice carried a gentle authority that made evasion impossible. "If you're fleeing legal troubles, there are ways to address such matters. You needn't face them alone." The kindness in his voice proved her undoing. Months of carrying her burden in isolation, of starting at every stranger's approach, of sleeping in hedgerows and abandoned buildings. It all crashed over her like a tide. She sank into the nearest chair, the letter falling from nerveless fingers to the floor. "I am not a criminal," she whispered. "Though I suppose in the eyes of the law, there may be little difference." Aldric retrieved the letter with careful deliberation. "May I?" Eleanor nodded, lacking the strength to refuse. She watched his face as he read, noting how his expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something approaching anger, though she sensed the anger was not directed at her. "Your husband died owing considerable debts," he said finally. 6 months ago. Consumption took him in the end. The worry might have killed him just as surely." Eleanor's voice steadied as she spoke of familiar pain. "Thomas was a good man, but not a wise one when it came to business ventures. He invested everything we had, and much we didn't have in a shipping enterprise that proved to be fraudulent. And his creditors hold you responsible for his debts. A wife inherits her husband's obligations along with his assets. Eleanor laughed bitterly. Though, in our case, the obligations far exceeded anything of value. They seized our home, our furniture, even my jewelry. When that proved insufficient, She paused, remembering the magistrate's cold pronouncement. Debtor's prison, Sir Aldric. They would see me locked away until the debt is satisfied, which is to say forever. Aldric set the letter aside, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. So you fled, like a thief in the night, yes, with nothing but what I could carry. Eleanor met his eyes, expecting to see disgust or disappointment. Instead, she found something that looked remarkably like admiration. I know how it must sound to a man of honor. It sounds like survival, Aldric interrupted. Any person faced with such circumstances would have done the same. Would they? Eleanor rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-cleared landscape. I tell myself that, but in the dark hours before dawn, I wonder if Thomas would be ashamed of me. If running makes me a coward, or it makes you wise enough to recognize when a battle cannot be won. His words carried an authority that suggested personal experience with such decisions. Eleanor turned back to him, studying his weathered face. You speak as one who understands difficult choices. I do. Aldric moved to stand beside her at the window. There are times when retreat is the only path to survival. The shame lies not in the retreat itself, but in failing to learn from what drove us to it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the morning light strengthen across the countryside. Eleanor found herself reluctant to leave this peaceful sanctuary, though she knew each hour she remained increased the danger to them both. I should go, she said finally. If the creditor's agents are searching, let them search. Aldric's voice held a note of steel that reminded her he had once been a knight. This is my land, and I decide who is welcome upon it. Eleanor stared at him. You would offer me sanctuary? But you barely know me. I know enough. Aldric turned from the window, his green eyes holding new determination. I know you're a woman fleeing injustice rather than justice. I know you've shown nothing but courtesy and grace despite your circumstances. I know this house has stood empty too long. The risk is mine to take. He moved to the fireplace, lifting down the battle-worn sword from its resting place. The blade sang softly as he drew it partially from its scabbard, revealing steel that, despite its age, held a keen edge. Let any man come seeking to drag. He backed to London's courts. They'll find this old knight has not forgotten how to defend what matters. Eleanor felt tears threaten at his unexpected protection. Why? Why would you do this for a stranger? Aldric resheathed the sword, hanging it carefully back in its place of honor. When he turned to face her, his expression held a vulnerability she had not seen before. Perhaps because in offering you shelter, I remember what it feels like to have a purpose beyond mere existence. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. Perhaps because this house was meant to shelter more than one lonely soul. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Eleanor felt the weight of possibility, the chance to stop running, to find peace, to matter to someone again. But with it came the terror of hope, which had proved so dangerous in the past. I have nothing to offer in return, she said softly. No dowry, no connections, no prospects. I'm a fugitive with empty hands. Your hands needn't be empty. Aldric gestured around the neglected hall. This place has known too little care for too long. If you're willing to work alongside me, we might restore it to something approaching its former dignity. Eleanor looked around the great hall with new eyes, seeing past the dust and neglect to the bones of a home that had once known joy. The thought of having purpose again, of creating rather than merely surviving, sent warmth through her chest. You would trust me with your home? I would trust you with more than that, given time." The words were quietly spoken, but they carried weight. That made Eleanor's heart quicken. She saw in Aldric's eyes the same yearning for connection that she carried in her own heart, the desire to matter to someone, to be part of something larger than solitary survival. "If I stay," she said carefully, "it must be as an equal partner in this endeavor. I'll not be kept as a charity case or a temporary guest." Aldric smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his austere features, revealing the man he might have been before grief carved such deep lines around his eyes. "And stay, Eleanor Hartwell. Help me remember what this place was meant to be." Eleanor moved to the great table where they had shared their quiet supper, running her fingers along the worn wood. Already, she could envision it polished to a gleam, surrounded by flowers from a restored garden, perhaps even graced with guests who might become friends. "Or do we begin?" she asked. Aldric joined her at the table, and for the first time since her arrival, the space between them felt comfortable rather than careful. "With trust," he said simply. "Everything else will follow." Outside, the wind had gentled to a whisper, and the sun broke through the clouds like a benediction. Eleanor felt something she had not experienced in months, the stirring of hope. Fragile but real, taking root in the fertile ground of unexpected kindness. Eleanor's first act as a partner, rather than a guest, was to unpack her precious sewing kit from the depths of her battered satchel. The small leather case had belonged to her mother, its contents worn smooth by generations of capable hands. She spread the tools across the great table needles of various sizes, spools of thread in faded colors, a tiny pair of sharp scissors, and a silver thimble that had somehow survived the creditor's inventory. "I may have little to contribute in terms of coin," she said, threading a needle with practiced ease, "but these hands know their business." Aldric watched from the doorway as she examined a tapestry that had been gathering dust in a corner. What had appeared beyond salvation to his untrained eye, Eleanor handled with the reverence of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. "This can be saved," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The foundation weave is still sound. With careful mending and proper cleaning, it might serve another century." He moved closer, drawn by her quiet confidence. "I confess, I had thought it fit only for the fire." Eleanor looked up at him with something approaching horror. "Sir Aldric, this piece tells the story of St. George and the dragon. See here." She pointed to a section where gold threads still caught the light. "The workmanship is extraordinary. Someone spent months, perhaps years, creating this beauty." "My grandmother commissioned it for the hall," Aldric admitted, surprised to find the memory brought warmth rather than pain. "She said every proper home needed a hero's tale to inspire its inhabitants. Then we shall restore her vision." Eleanor's voice carried quiet determination. "Though it will take time. Time is something we appear to have in abundance." Over the following days, Eleanor established a rhythm that gradually transformed the manor's atmosphere. She rose early, before Aldric stirred, and began each morning by opening shutters and windows to let fresh air chase away the mustiness of neglect. The sounds of her movement, the soft whisper of brooms across stone, the gentle splash of water in basins, the rustle of linens being shaken and hung, became a symphony of renewal that pulled Aldric from dreams he had thought buried forever. He found himself rising earlier each morning, drawn by the sounds of purposeful activity and, if he were honest, by the desire to share these quiet hours with Eleanor. She worked with an efficiency born of necessity, but also with a care that spoke of genuine affection for the tasks at hand. "You needn't do everything at once," he said one morning, finding her polishing the massive oak table until it gleamed like dark honey. "I needn't," she agreed, not pausing in her work. "But I want to. This house deserves better than what it's endured." Aldric found himself studying her profile as she worked, noting the way concentration softened her features. The wariness that had marked her arrival was fading, replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment. "You speak of the house as if it were alive," he observed. Eleanor paused in her polishing, considering his words. "Aren't all homes alive in their way? They hold our joys and sorrows, our arguments and reconciliations. They remember the sound of children's laughter and the weight of tears shed in solitude." She resumed her work with gentler strokes. "This house remembers happiness, Sir Aldric. I can feel it in the very stones." A word stirred something in his chest, a recognition of truth he had tried to deny. The manor did remember. That was why he had spent so many years trying to silence its memories, boarding up rooms and turning portraits to face the walls. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time to let it remember properly." That afternoon, Aldric did something he had not done in 15 years. He opened the door to his late wife's solar. Dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of light that illuminated furniture draped in holland covers. Eleanor, who had been mending in the great hall, appeared at his shoulder as if summoned by the significance of the moment. "This was Sarah's domain," he said, his voice rusty with disuse. "I sealed it after." "Well, after?" Eleanor said nothing, but her presence beside him felt like silent support. Together, they stepped into the chamber that time had preserved like an insect in amber. When Aldric pulled away the first dust cover, revealing a delicate writing desk still adorned with dried flowers in a crystal vase, Eleanor drew a soft breath. She had exquisite taste, Eleanor said, running gentle fingers along the desk's inlaid surface. She had strong opinions about beauty, Aldric replied, managing a smile. She said life was too short to surround oneself with anything less than lovely. Eleanor moved through the solar with the careful reverence of a pilgrim in a sacred space. She touched nothing without permission, a glance toward Aldric, a raised eyebrow asking consent before disturbing Sarah's carefully arranged possessions. "This room could be beautiful again," she said finally. "Not the same as it was, but beautiful in a new way." Aldric understood her meaning. The solar could be restored without being a shrine, cleaned and cared for without being preserved as a monument to grief. Sarah would have liked that, he said. She never believed in letting beauty waste away. Eleanor's hands, Aldric noticed, were never idle. Even during their evening conversations by the fire, her fingers worked at some task mending, torn curtains, embroidering new cushion covers, or darning stockings that had seen better days. She possessed an almost magical ability to see potential where others saw only decay. "Where did you learn such skills?" he asked one evening, watching her repair a table runner with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. "Necessity," Eleanor replied, not looking up from her work. "When Thomas's business began to fail, we had to dismiss the servants. I learned to make do with my own hands, rather than spend money we didn't possess." She paused, needle halfway through the fabric. "I discovered I rather enjoyed the work. There's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it whole again." Aldric heard the deeper meaning in her words, the hope that broken things, perhaps broken people, could indeed be made whole. "You have a gift for restoration." "Perhaps. We both do," Eleanor said, finally meeting his eyes. "You've certainly restored my faith in human kindness." The compliment settled between them like a bridge, fragile but real. Aldric found himself remembering what it felt like to matter to someone, to have his actions observed and appreciated. Eleanor's presence was transforming more than just his manner. It was awakening parts of himself he had thought lost forever. That night, as Eleanor retired to her chamber, she paused at the foot of the stairs. "Sir Aldric? Thank you for opening Sarah's solar today. I know it wasn't easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," he replied. "Sleep well, Eleanor." As her footsteps faded up the stairs, Aldric remained by the dying fire, marveling at how naturally the words of endearment came to his lips. When had Eleanor ceased to be a stranger taking shelter and become simply Eleanor, someone whose happiness mattered to him, whose presence had become as essential as warmth and light? The answer, he realized, lay not in any single moment, but in the accumulation of small kindnesses, shared tasks, and quiet conversations that had woven their lives together like threads in one of Eleanor's careful repairs. The pattern was becoming clear, even if neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge what they were creating together. Eleanor discovered Aldric's poetry by accident while cleaning his study, a chamber he had insisted needed no attention from. Her careful hands. But dust, she had learned, was no respecter of boundaries, and she could not bear to see the beautiful walnut desk growing dim beneath layers of neglect. She had been polishing the desktop when her cloth caught the corner of a leather-bound journal, sending it tumbling to the floor. Pages scattered like autumn leaves, revealing lines of careful script that made her pause mid-reach. The words seemed to pull at her eyes, demanding to be read, despite her instinct to gather them quickly and pretend she had seen nothing. In chambers, where the firelight dies and shadows claim what love once blessed, I walk among the ghosts of sighs that haunt these halls of hollow rest. Eleanor's hands stilled. The verse continued across the page in Aldric's distinctive hand, each word chosen with the precision she had come to associate with everything he did. But these were not the words of the careful, measured man she knew. These verses bled with raw emotion, speaking of loss and loneliness with a poet's unflinching honesty. "What are you doing?" Eleanor started at Aldric's voice from the doorway, guilt flooding her cheeks with color. The scattered pages lay between them like evidence of a crime, and she saw his face change as he realized what she had discovered. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, dropping to her knees to gather the pages. "I was only cleaning, and the journal fell. I didn't mean to PRY. Don't." Aldric's voice was sharp enough to stop her mid-sentence. He strode forward and knelt beside her, his hands covering hers as they both reached for the same page. "Please, don't apologize for finding what I was too cowardly to share." Eleanor looked up to find his face much closer than expected, close enough to see the vulnerability in his green eyes. "These are yours? My shame, yes." Aldric's hands remained over hers, warm and slightly trembling. "Poetry was never meant to be a knight's pursuit. Sarah used to tease me about my secret verses." "Tease you?" Eleanor's voice carried genuine disbelief. "Sir Aldric, these are beautiful. This line, 'I walk among the ghosts of sighs,' it captures exactly what this house felt like when I first arrived." Aldric released her hands and sat back on his heels, studying her face as if searching for signs of mockery. "You're not merely being kind. I'm being honest." Eleanor carefully lifted the page she had been reading. "May I?" At his hesitant nod, she continued reading aloud, her voice giving life to words that had been locked in darkness for too long. "No morning breaks on empty rooms, and daylight finds no purpose here. Still hope persists through all the glooms, that one day love might reappear." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to name. Eleanor saw Aldric's face change as he heard his own verse spoken with reverence rather than judgment. "When did you write this?" she asked softly. 3 years passed. It was ... a difficult winter. Aldric took the page from her hands, his fingers tracing the words he had penned in solitude. "I had begun to wonder if I would live out my days entirely alone. And now?" Their eyes met across the scattered pages, and Eleanor felt the air between them shift into something charged with possibility. Aldric's gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest moment before returning to her eyes. "Now I find myself hoping I was wrong." Eleanor's heart performed an intricate dance beneath her ribs. She had thought herself beyond such feelings, had believed that part of her heart had been buried with Thomas. But Aldric's quiet confession awakened something she had thought lost forever, the sweet terror of beginning to care for someone new. "I should let you gather these in private," she said, though she made no move to rise. "Stay." The word came out more urgently than Aldric seemed to intend. He modulated his tone, trying again. "That is, if you would like to stay. I've never shared these with anyone save Sarah." Eleanor settled more comfortably on the floor, her skirts spreading around her like a blue pool. "I would be honored to hear them." What followed was perhaps the most intimate hour Eleanor had experienced since Thomas's death. Aldric read his verses with the self-consciousness of a man unaccustomed to revealing his heart, but his words painted vivid pictures of his journey through grief towards something approaching peace. Some poems spoke of Sarah with the tender ache of a love that had known fulfillment. Others traced his long years of solitude with unflinching honesty. But it was the most recent verses that made Eleanor's pulse quicken, poems that spoke of unexpected light, of hope returning like a lost bird to its roost. "This one," she said, pointing to a page dated only weeks before her arrival. "What inspired this?" Aldric read the opening lines. "If mercy wears a mortal face and kindness walks on human feet, then grace might yet find this dark place and make a broken heart complete." His eyes met hers over the page. "I dreamed of you," he said simply. "Weeks before you appeared at my gate, I dreamed of a woman who would change everything. I thought it was merely wishful thinking made manifest in sleep." Eleanor's breath caught. "You dreamed of me?" A figure in the storm, bringing light to dark places. Aldric set the page aside, his attention fully on her face. "When I found you beneath the archway, it was like watching a dream become flesh." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Eleanor found herself leaning slightly forward, drawn by the warmth in Aldric's eyes. "I have dreams too," she whispered. "Dreams where I'm not running anymore. Where I belong somewhere, to someone. Eleanor." Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. They were so close now that Eleanor could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the possibility of a kiss hung between them, tender, tentative, full of promise. Then the sound of hoofbeats on the cobbled yard outside broke the spell like glass against stone. They sprang apart, both reaching instinctively for the scattered pages as if to hide the evidence of their intimacy. "Visitors," Aldric said unnecessarily, rising to peer out the window. "Father Benedict, from the village church." Eleanor's hands trembled as she helped gather the remaining poems. The moment that had almost been shimmered between them like heat from a fire, impossible to recapture, but equally impossible to forget. "I should receive him properly," Aldric said, though his eyes remained on Eleanor's face. "Of course." Eleanor smoothed her skirts and attempted to restore some semblance of composure to her appearance. "Shall I prepare refreshments?" "That would be ... yes. Thank you." As Eleanor busied herself in the kitchen, her hands moved automatically through the familiar tasks while her mind replayed every moment of the past hour. Aldric's poetry had revealed depths to his character she had only glimpsed before, sensitivity that spoke to her own artistic nature, a capacity for beauty that had survived even the darkest periods of his grief. But more than that, she had seen in his eyes the same longing that lived in her own heart, the desire to be known completely and accepted wholly. For those few precious minutes, she had felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with charity or convenience and everything to do with the mysterious alchemy that draws two souls together. The poetry journal, now carefully reassembled and resting on Aldric's desk, had become more than a collection of verses. It was a map of his heart, and he had trusted her to read it. The weight of that trust and the implications of what had almost happened between them made Eleanor's hands shake as she arranged biscuits on a plate. Change was coming to the manor. She could feel it in her bones. The question was whether they would have the courage to welcome it when it arrived. Eleanor discovered the ring quite by accident while cleaning Sarah's solar, which had become her favorite task now that Aldric had given his blessing to restore the chamber. She was polishing a small mahogany jewelry box when the catch gave way beneath her cloth, spilling its contents across the delicate writing desk. Most of the pieces were what she expected: a strand of pearls, a few silver brooches, earrings set with modest gems. But nestled among them was something that made her breath catch: a wedding ring of exquisite craftsmanship, its gold band worn smooth by years of wear, set with a single sapphire that caught the afternoon light like captured sky. Eleanor lifted the ring with trembling fingers, immediately recognizing it as something precious beyond its monetary value. The inside of the band bore an inscription in Latin: Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. This was not merely jewelry. It was a token of devotion, a symbol of promises made and kept. That was my mother's. Eleanor spun to find Aldric standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She had been so absorbed in the ring's beauty that she hadn't heard his approach. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, moving to replace the ring in the box. "I was only cleaning, and the catch. Please." Aldric entered the solar and approached the desk. "Don't put it away. I haven't seen it in years." Eleanor held the ring on her palm, offering it to him. But instead of taking it, Aldric simply stood looking at it, his face soft with memory. "My father gave it to my mother on their wedding day," he said. "They had very little money. He was a younger son with only his sword to recommend him. But he saved for 2 years to commission that ring from a goldsmith in London." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, meaning every word. "They were married for 37 years, Aldric continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times. "Through wars, famines, the loss of 2 children in their infancy. My mother used to say that ring was her anchor. When storms came, she would touch it and remember that love was stronger than any trial." Eleanor studied his face, noting the way his eyes had softened with remembrance. What happened to them? "Fever took them both within a week of each other. The winter I turned 25. My mother gave me the ring on her deathbed, made me promise to save it for the woman who would complete my life." Aldric's smile held both joy and sorrow. "I gave it to Sarah on our wedding night." The admission created a moment of profound intimacy between them. Eleanor understood she was holding not just a ring but a piece of Aldric's history, a tangible link to the love that had shaped him. "She must have treasured it," Eleanor said softly. "She did. But more than that, she understood what it represented." Aldric moved closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the gold flecks in his green eyes. "Sarah used to say the ring carried the blessing of every love that had worn it, that each couple added their strength to its power." Eleanor's heart performed an intricate dance as the implications of his words settled between them. And now? Now, I find myself wondering if my mother's blessing might extend to another worthy woman. Their eyes met across the small space that separated them, and Eleanor felt the world shift on its axis. The ring seemed to grow warm in her palm, as if responding to the emotions swirling around it. A sharp rap at the manor's front door shattered the moment like glass. Aldric's expression shifted from tender possibility to alert concern. Visitors were rare at the manor, and Eleanor's presence made any unexpected callers a potential threat. "Stay here," Aldric said, his voice taking on the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Let me see who it is." But Eleanor was already moving toward the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the figures in the courtyard below. 2 men in dark traveling clothes, their horses bearing the dust of hard riding. The taller of the 2 held an official-looking document, and even from this distance, Eleanor could see the seal that marked it as a court order. "They've found me," she whispered, the ring falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the desktop. "Aldric." joined her at the window, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene below. Debt collectors? Worse. Magistrates' men. Eleanor's voice was steady despite the terror flooding her veins. They have the authority to arrest me and transport me back to London for trial. Not on my land, they don't. The steel in Aldric's voice reminded Eleanor that beneath his gentle manner lay a knight who had once faced enemies with sword and shield. But these weren't bandits or foreign invaders. These were officers of the crown, backed by the full weight of English law. Sir Aldric, you cannot interfere with a legal proceeding. It would make you an accomplice to my flight. Then we'll make it legal. Aldric turned from the window, his face set with determination. You'll not go back to London, Eleanor. Not if there's anything I can do to prevent it. Eleanor stared at him, seeing in his expression an echo of the protective fury that had once made him a formidable warrior. What are you saying? I'm saying there are laws that supersede debt collection. Aldric moved to the jewelry box and retrieved his mother's ring, holding it out to Eleanor with hands that trembled slightly. A wife cannot be held responsible for debts incurred before her marriage. English law is quite clear on that point. Eleanor's eyes widened as understanding crashed over her. You're asking me to. I'm asking you to save yourself. And perhaps, in the process, to save me as well. The ring lay between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Eleanor stared at it, her mind reeling with the implications of what Aldric was proposing. Marriage is sanctuary, yes, but also marriage to a man she had come to care for deeply, a man whose poetry had revealed depths of character that called to her own heart. The risk to you is mine to take. Aldric's voice was gentle but firm. Eleanor, I've lived 15 years as a dead man walking. You've brought life back to this house, back to me. If those men take you away, I'll return to being a ghost haunting empty rooms. Below, one of the magistrate's men was pounding on the door with increasing urgency. Time was running out for deliberation, for careful consideration of consequences. Eleanor looked at the ring, then at Aldric's face, seeing in his eyes not just determination but something deeper affection, respect, and the tentative beginning of love. Are you certain? She whispered. More certain than I've been of anything. In 15 years. Eleanor reached for the ring with hands that shook only slightly. As her fingers closed around the cool metal, she felt the weight of history, all the love and commitment it had witnessed, all the promises it had sealed. Then yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, Aldric. I'll marry you. The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He took her hands in his, the ring pressed between their palms like a talisman. We'll need Father Benedict, he said, and witnesses. The ceremony must be legally binding, beyond any challenge. Can we manage it before? Another thunderous knock from below answered her question. The magistrate's men were losing patience, and soon they would simply force their way inside. Leave that to me, Aldric said, pressing a quick kiss to her knuckles before releasing her hands. Get yourself ready, Eleanor. In an hour's time, you'll be my wife, and no power in England will take you from this place. As he strode from the solar with renewed purpose, Eleanor sank into Sarah's chair, the ring clutched against her heart. Change had come to the manor with the speed of lightning, and she could only pray she was strong enough to weather the storm it would surely bring. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the small wooden chest where she kept her most precious possessions. Buried beneath layers of carefully folded fabric lay the locket Thomas's last gift to her, given on their final wedding anniversary when he was already growing thin with the illness that would claim him. She lifted the golden oval with reverent care, pressing the tiny catch that revealed the miniature portrait within. Thomas's face smiled back at her, captured in oils so fine they seemed to hold the warmth of life itself. Beneath his portrait, in script so small it required careful attention to read, were the words he had inscribed, "My beloved Eleanor, until we meet again." The locket had been her comfort through the dark months of his decline, through the terrible loneliness that followed his death, through the desperate flight from London when his creditors came calling. Now, as she prepared to pledge herself to another man, it felt like both a blessing and a betrayal. "Thomas," she whispered to the portrait, "help me know if this is right." But Thomas's painted eyes offered no guidance, only the gentle sadness that had marked his final months. Eleanor closed the locket and held it against her heart, feeling the familiar weight of grief mixed now with something new hope, fragile but genuine, for a future she had never dared imagine. A soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her reverie. "Eleanor?" Aldric's voice carried a note of urgency. "Father Benedict has arrived. Are you ready?" Ready. Such a simple word to encompass the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. Eleanor rose from her chair, smoothing the blue dress that had become her daily uniform. It would have to serve as a wedding gown, though she found herself wishing for something that better honored the solemnity of the occasion. "Nearly," she called back, slipping the locket's chain over her head. The pendant settled against her breast. Like a guardian angel, Thomas's presence blessing rather than condemning what was to come. When she opened the door, Aldric stood waiting in the corridor, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of him. He had transformed himself from the casual country gentleman she knew into something approaching his former knightly dignity. His dark hair was neatly tied back, his beard trimmed, his clothing pressed and brushed until it rivaled court attire. But it was the expression in his eyes that stole her words, a mixture of determination, tenderness, and barely controlled fear. "You look beautiful," he said softly, and Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the circumstances. "As do you." She paused, studying his face. "Are you having second thoughts?" "About marrying you? Never." Aldric extended his arm, and Eleanor slipped her hand through the crook of his elbow. "About the haste, perhaps. You deserve better than a wedding born of desperation." Eleanor felt the solid strength of his arm beneath her fingers, the steady warmth that had become her anchor in an uncertain world. "I deserve a chance at happiness," she said quietly. "As do you. Sometimes happiness comes in unexpected forms." They descended the stairs together, their footsteps echoing in the stone hallway. In the great hall, Eleanor was surprised to find they would not be alone for their nuptials. Father Benedict stood before the restored tapestry, his weathered hands holding the leather-bound Bible that would sanctify their union. Beside him waited two witnesses, Mrs. Cotter from the village bakery and her husband Tom, both wearing their finest clothes and broad smiles. "My dear child," Father Benedict said, approaching Eleanor with grandfatherly warmth, "Sir Aldric has explained the urgency of your situation. You should know that I've had the magistrate's men cooling their heels in the village tavern for the past hour, enjoying the hospitality of our local ale." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "You sent them away?" "I informed them that as a man of God, I required time to verify certain legal documents before they could proceed with their business." The priest's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Religious authority still carries some weight in these matters, my dear." Mrs. Cotter stepped forward, pressing a small bouquet of wild flowers into Eleanor's hands. "From my garden," she said kindly. "Every bride should have flowers on her wedding day." The gesture of acceptance from the village folk brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. These people knew nothing of her past, only that their reclusive knight had finally found someone worthy of his affection. Their presence transformed what could have been a desperate legal maneuver into something approaching a true celebration. Aldric took his place beside Eleanor before the makeshift altar, and Father Benedict opened his Bible with practiced reverence. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent joining hearts and souls, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to witness the union of Aldric and Eleanor in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over Eleanor like a blessing, but it was Aldric's steady presence beside her that gave her strength. When Father Benedict asked for the rings, Aldric produced his mother's sapphire band, the gem catching the light from the tall windows like a captured star. "This ring," Aldric said, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment, "has blessed 2 marriages before ours. May it carry their strength into our union." Eleanor felt the cool metal slide onto her finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged. The fit was perfect, as if destiny itself had ordained this moment. When it came time for her response, she reached for the locket at her throat. "I have no ring to offer in return," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "But I offer this instead, a symbol of love honored and remembered, and the promise that our union builds upon rather than replaces what came before." With careful fingers, she opened the locket and removed Thomas's portrait, placing it gently in Aldric's palm. "My first husband's blessing on our marriage," she whispered, "and his assurance that love multiplies rather than diminishes when shared." Aldric's eyes widened as he understood the magnitude of her gesture. She was not abandoning her past, but integrating it into their future, honoring Thomas's memory while embracing new possibilities. He closed his fingers around the miniature portrait, holding it as carefully as he might hold a sacred relic. "I promise to honor his memory as you honor mine," he said solemnly. "Our love will be built on the foundation of all love that came before." Father Benedict smiled at their improvised exchange, recognizing the deeper vows being made beneath his formal ceremony. "By the power vested in me by God and the Church of England," he declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Sir Aldric, you may kiss your bride." Aldric turned to Eleanor, his eyes seeking permission for this most intimate of celebrations. Eleanor smiled and lifted her face to his, closing her eyes as his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle, reverent, and full of promise. It was not the passionate embrace of young lovers, but something deeper, the quiet commitment of 2 souls choosing to walk forward together. When they parted, Eleanor was surprised to see tears in Aldric's eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, so quietly only she could hear, "for saving us both." The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell of their private moment. Through the windows, they could see the magistrate's men returning, their patience apparently exhausted. But now Eleanor faced them not as a fugitive, but as Lady Eleanor Thornwick, wife to a knight of the realm. "Let them come," she said, her voice steady with new confidence. "They'll find a very different woman than the one they seek." Aldric squeezed her hand, the sapphire ring catching the light like a shield against all threats. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone, a sanctuary built not just of stone and timber, but of trust, respect, and the beginning of love. Father Benedict closed his Bible with a satisfied smile. "Now then," he said cheerfully, "shall we greet these gentlemen and inform them that their journey has been in vain?" Eleanor looked around the great hall, at the restored tapestry, the gleaming table, the flowers Mrs. Cotter had brought from her garden. This was her home now, and she would defend it with all the strength her new position afforded her. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Let's tell them exactly what they need to know." 3 days after their wedding, Eleanor discovered a document that would change everything. She had been searching through the manor's library for legal precedents that might strengthen their position against any future challenges to their marriage when her fingers found the hidden compartment in Aldric's desk, small drawer concealed behind a false panel that opened only when pressed in a specific sequence. Inside lay a collection of papers tied with a faded ribbon, the original deed to Thornwick Manor, various legal documents, and correspondence dating back decades. Eleanor might have simply retied the bundle and returned it to its hiding place, but one name caught her eye on the uppermost document, a name that made her blood turn to ice: Thomas Hartwell. Her late husband's signature, bold and confident. adorning a bill of sale dated 3 years before his death. With trembling hands, Eleanor untied the ribbon and spread the documents across the desk. The truth emerged like a physical blow. Thomas had owned Thornwick Manor. Not only owned it, but sold it to Sir Aldric Thornwick for the sum of £800 to fund what the correspondence revealed was his disastrous shipping venture. Eleanor sank into Aldric's chair, the papers blurring before her eyes as the implications crashed over her. Thomas had owned this house, these lands, this very desk where she now sat. He had walked these halls, perhaps slept in the chamber where she and Aldric now shared their marriage bed. And in his desperation to save his failing business, he had sold it all to a reclusive knight who needed a refuge from his own ghosts. Eleanor, Aldric's voice from the doorway made her start. "I've been looking for what's wrong." She could not speak, could only gesture mutely at the papers spread before her. Aldric approached slowly, his expression shifting from concern to comprehension as he recognized the documents she had discovered. "You found them," he said quietly. "You knew." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "You knew Thomas was my husband. You knew this was his house." Aldric moved around the desk, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Not at first. Not when you arrived that night in the storm. I had no idea who you were. But you learned." Eleanor stood abruptly, backing away from him. When did you realize that the woman you were sheltering was the widow of the man who sold you this house?" Aldric's face was pale but resolute. "When I read the letter from the magistrates, they mentioned your husband by name, and I remembered the correspondence from years past. Thomas Hartwell had been most apologetic about the sale, explained that circumstances forced his hand, and you said nothing." Eleanor's voice grew stronger, fueled by a mixture of betrayal and confusion. "You let me pour my heart out to you about Thomas's death, about our financial ruin, about the creditors, and all the time you knew you were part of the reason for our troubles." "No." Aldric stepped toward her, his voice urgent. "Eleanor, you must understand the money I paid Thomas went toward his debts. I saved him from immediate ruin. If anything, the sale of this property gave him 3 more years than he might have had otherwise." Eleanor shook her head, trying to process the magnitude of this revelation. "You bought our home. The place where Thomas and I were happy, where we planned to grow old together. You took it from us." "I bought a property that was already lost," Aldric said gently. "Thomas came to me through intermediaries, desperate for a quick sale. He could have found other buyers, probably for more money, but he needed someone who would complete the transaction immediately. I gave him what he needed." The room spun around Eleanor as she tried to reconcile this information with everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her current situation. "This is why you helped me," she said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "Guilt. You felt responsible for what happened to Thomas, so when his widow appeared at your door, that's not true." Aldric's voice carried a note of desperation. "Yes, I felt some responsibility when I realized who you were. But that's not why I offered you sanctuary, and it's certainly not why I married you. Isn't it?" Eleanor's eyes blazed with hurt and anger. "How can I believe anything you say? You've been lying to me since the moment I arrived." "I haven't lied. I simply didn't know how to tell you a truth that would hurt you needlessly." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Needlessly? Aldric, I've been living in my own house, the house my husband sold to keep us from debtor's prison, and you didn't think I had a right to know?" The accusation hit its mark. Aldric's shoulders sagged as if bearing the weight of her words. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have told you the moment I realized I was a coward." "You were worse than a coward." Eleanor moved to the window, unable to bear looking at him. "You were calculating. You saw an opportunity to ease your conscience by helping Thomas's widow, and you took it." "Eleanor, please, don't." She held up a hand, stopping his approach. I need to think. I need to understand what any of this means. Silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and shattered trust. Eleanor stared out at the gardens, where Aldric had taught her to tend his mother's roses, seeing them now with different eyes. Had Thomas walked these same paths? Had he stood at this very window, contemplating the sale that would strip away everything familiar from his life? There's something else you should know, Aldric said finally, his voice barely audible. Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing herself for another revelation. What? The money from the sale, I never spent it. Every penny sits in a London bank, earning interest. I always intended to return it someday, though I never imagined the circumstances would be these. Eleanor turned slowly to face him. You kept it, all of it? Thomas was selling his birthright to pay debts that weren't truly his fault. The shipping venture that ruined him was based on fraudulent promises from men who disappeared with his investment. I couldn't profit from another man's tragedy, even unknowingly. The admission added another layer of complexity to Eleanor's already reeling thoughts. So you've been living in a house you never truly claimed, keeping money you felt you hadn't earned, waiting for a chance to make amends. Waiting for a purpose that never came, Aldric corrected. Until you arrived and gave meaning back to this place. Eleanor sank back into the chair, her anger temporarily overwhelmed by exhaustion. I don't know what to think anymore. I don't know what's real and what's manipulation. Did you marry me to save me from the magistrates, or to save yourself from guilt? Aldric knelt beside her chair, his eyes earnest with a plea for understanding. I married you because in 3 weeks, you transformed this mausoleum into a home, because your presence made me remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. Because when I thought of losing you, I realized I had already given you my heart. Eleanor studied his face, searching for signs of deception and finding only vulnerable honesty. And the fact that I'm Thomas's widow? That this was his house? Makes our connection feel like providence rather than coincidence. Aldric reached for her hands, hesitating when she didn't immediately offer them. Eleanor, Thomas loved this place. He wrote to me about the gardens, about the way morning light filled the great hall, about the peace he found here. If there are such things as blessings from beyond the grave, perhaps he guided you here because he knew you would be safe. The suggestion was too much to process in her current state of emotional upheaval. Eleanor stood abruptly, moving away from Aldric's earnest gaze. I need air. I need to walk and think. Of course. Aldric rose as well, maintaining his distance. Should I come with you? No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I need to be alone with this. Eleanor fled the library as if escaping a fire, her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. Outside, the gardens that had become her sanctuary now felt like a maze of memories, hers and Thomas's intertwined in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she walked the familiar paths, one truth emerged with crystal clarity. Her marriage to Aldric had been built on incomplete information, and she could not move forward until she understood whether their connection was real or merely the product of circumstances neither had fully acknowledged. The answer, she realized, would determine not just the future of their union, but her ability to trust her own heart ever again. Eleanor spent the night in Sarah's solar, sleeping fitfully on the small sofa, rather than returning to the chamber she had shared with Aldric for 3 brief days. When dawn broke gray and cold through the diamond-paned windows, she found herself staring at her wedding dress, the same blue gown she'd worn for her marriage to Thomas, carefully preserved through years of careful mending and hope she had brought it from London wrapped in tissue paper, one of the few possessions the creditors had overlooked in their zealous inventory. The dress had survived Thomas's death, the loss of their home, a desperate flight, and now it hung in the wardrobe like a monument to dreams that seemed forever beyond her grasp. A soft knock interrupted her melancholy examination of the gown. Eleanor? Aldric's voice carried a note of uncertainty that she had never heard before. May I come in? Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened a door to find her husband. The words still felt strange standing in the corridor, with a breakfast tray. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had slept no better than she. I thought you might be hungry, he said, offering the tray with the careful formality of a servant rather than a spouse. Eleanor accepted the offering, noting the way Aldric kept his distance, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. The thoughtfulness of the gesture: fresh bread, honey from his own hives, tea prepared exactly as she preferred, made her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, she said, setting the tray on Sarah's writing desk. That was kind. Eleanor, about yesterday. I've been thinking, she interrupted, unable to bear another explanation just yet. About the house, about Thomas, about everything that brought us to this moment. Aldric waited, his green eyes shadowed with apprehension. I need to see the correspondence, Eleanor continued. All of it? Every letter Thomas wrote to you, every document related to the sale. I need to understand his state of mind when he made the decision to sell. Of course, Aldric's relief was palpable. I'll bring everything to you immediately, and I want to see the bank records, the account where you've kept the money. Eleanor, that money belongs to you now. As my wife, everything I own is yours. By law, the irony was not lost on her. So I inherit my own husband's money, paid for my own home, through marriage to the man who bought both. Eleanor shook her head at the circular nature of their situation. There's a certain justice in it, I suppose. Aldric flinched at her tone. I never wanted it to be about money. But it is about money, isn't it? At least partially. Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at gardens that Thomas had once tended. The magistrates wouldn't have pursued me if Thomas's debts hadn't driven him to sell everything he owned. You wouldn't have been living in isolation if you hadn't felt guilty about profiting from another man's desperation. And I wouldn't have needed sanctuary if I hadn't been fleeing the consequences of those same debts. And yet here we are, Aldric sighed quietly. 3 lives connected by circumstances none of us could have predicted. Eleanor turned to study his face, seeing the man she had come to care for overlaid with this new knowledge of his connection to her past. Do you believe in fate, Aldric? I believe in providence, he replied carefully. I believe that sometimes the most painful paths lead to the most necessary destinations, even when those paths are built on secrets. Aldric's shoulders sagged. Especially then. The truth has a way of emerging when we're strong enough to bear it. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope at his words. Perhaps her anger was premature, her sense of betrayal colored by too many losses and disappointments. Perhaps there was still a foundation upon which they could build something real. Bring me the papers, she said. All of them. And then we'll decide what comes next. Aldric nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. Eleanor? Whatever you decide about us, about this marriage, know that my feelings for you are real. They have nothing to do with guilt or obligation, or any connection to your first husband. What I feel for you belongs entirely to the woman you are, not the woman you were. After he left, Eleanor sank into Sarah's chair and tried to sort through the tangle of emotions in her chest. Hurt, certainly, at being kept in ignorance. Confusion about the strange symmetry that had brought her to Thornwick Manor. But underneath it all, a stubborn warmth that refused to be extinguished. The memory of Aldric's gentle hands tending her fever. His poetry revealing depths of sensitivity that called to her own artistic nature. The way he had looked at her during their wedding ceremony. As if she were the answer to prayers he had been afraid to voice. When Aldric returned an hour later, he carried a leather portfolio containing every document related to his purchase of the manor. Eleanor spread the papers across Sarah's desk, noting immediately the respectful tone of Thomas's initial inquiry and Aldric's equally courteous responses. Thomas's letters painted a picture of a man caught between desperation and dignity, explaining his circumstances with painful honesty while maintaining the careful pride that had marked his character. He wrote of Eleanor with such tender devotion that reading his words brought tears to her eyes. "My wife believes we can recover from this setback," Thomas had written in his second letter. "She has such faith in new beginnings, such hope for our future. I sell this property not to abandon our dreams, but to give them time to grow elsewhere." Eleanor's hand trembled as she read Aldric's response. "I am honored to purchase a home that has known such happiness. Rest assured that Thornwick Manor will be cared for with the respect it deserves." "You corresponded for months," Eleanor observed, noting the dates on various letters. "Thomas wanted to ensure the property went to someone who would value it properly," Aldric explained. "He could have sold to developers who planned to divide the land or to investors who cared nothing for its history. Instead, he chose someone who promised to preserve what he had built." Eleanor found a letter dated just weeks before Thomas's. "Death. His handwriting noticeably weaker, but his sentiments unchanged. I take comfort knowing that Thornwick Manor remains in worthy hands. Should anything happen to me, I hope my Eleanor might someday see her former home and know that love continues to dwell within its walls." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Thomas had thought of her even in his final days, had hoped she might find her way back to this place, not as a fugitive or a reluctant bride, but as someone who belonged here. "He knew," she whispered. "Somehow, he knew I would end up here." Aldric moved to stand behind her chair, his presence warm and steady. "Perhaps that's why I dreamed of you before you arrived. Perhaps Thomas was trying to tell us both something we weren't ready to hear." Eleanor leaned back against his solid warmth, allowing herself to accept comfort for the first time since discovering the truth. "What do you think he was trying to tell us?" "That love doesn't end with death. That happiness can be built on the foundation of previous happiness. That you were meant to be here with me, continuing the story this house was always meant to tell." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the pieces of her shattered world beginning to realign into a new pattern. "I was so angry," she admitted. "I felt manipulated, used." "You had every right to be angry. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. Would I have stayed if you had?" Aldric considered the question seriously. "I don't know. But I should have given you the choice to make that decision with complete information." Eleanor turned in the chair to face him, studying the beloved features that had become as familiar as her own reflection. "And now? What choice do I have now?" "Every choice," Aldric said, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. "You can have the marriage annulled on grounds of concealment. You can take the money and start fresh somewhere new. You can stay but demand we begin again as strangers. Or," he paused, vulnerability flickering across his features, "you can choose to see this revelation as the final piece of a puzzle that was always meant to come together." Eleanor reached for his hands, noting how they trembled slightly at her touch. "What would you have me choose?" "I would have you choose happiness," Aldric said simply. "Whether that's with me or without me. You've had too little of it in recent years." Eleanor felt her anger dissolving like morning mist, replaced by something deeper and more complex. She thought of Thomas's letters, of his hope that she might someday find her way back to this place. She thought of Aldric's poetry, revealing a soul that resonated with her own. She thought of the way the manor had come alive under their joint care, as if the house itself approved of their partnership. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said, drawing strength from his steady presence. "The villagers who witnessed our wedding, they'll need to know the truth about my past if we're to build a life here. Secrets have a way of surfacing, and I won't live in fear of discovery." "Whatever you think is best," Aldric agreed. "Though I suspect the village will care more about your character than your history." "And the magistrates?" "They accepted our marriage as legally binding. But what if they investigate further? What if they discover the connection between Thomas and his property? Aldric's jaw tightened with determination. Let them investigate. Our marriage is legal and binding. You are Lady Eleanor Thornwick now, and no court in England can change that fact. Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips despite the gravity of their situation. Lady Eleanor Thornwick. It has a certain ring to it. It suits you, Aldric said, his own smile answering hers. You were meant to bear this name, even if it comes with a manor full of ghosts and a husband who keeps momentous secrets. Especially then. Aldric lifted her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. Eleanor, I know I've given you reason to doubt my honesty, but I need you to know this. Every word I spoke during our wedding ceremony was true. I love you, not as Thomas's widow, not as the solution to my guilt, but as yourself alone. Eleanor felt her heart perform the familiar dance that had marked all her interactions with this complicated, honorable, frustrating man. And I love you, she admitted, the words coming easier than she had expected, which is why your secrecy hurt so deeply. I thought we were building something honest together. We were. We are. Aldric's grip on her hands tightened. The foundation was real, Eleanor. The feelings, the connection, the way we fit together, none of that was manufactured or false. The only lie was my failure to share what I knew about your past. A significant lie. Yes, but not a fatal one, if you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Eleanor studied his face, seeing past the worry and guilt to the essential goodness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. She thought of all the small kindnesses he had shown her, all the moments of genuine connection they had shared. She thought of his poetry, revealing a soul that understood loss and longing as deeply as she did. I forgive you, she said finally. But this is our last secret, Aldric. From now on, we share everything, the good, the bad, and the complicated. Relief flooded his features like sunrise after storm. Everything, he promised. No more hidden truths. Then, let's begin with this truth. I choose to stay. I choose this marriage, this life, this complicated, beautiful mess we've created together. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. I choose you, Aldric Thornwick, with full knowledge of who you are and what brought us together. And I choose you, Eleanor Thornwick, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Today and every day after. The kiss that followed was different from their wedding kiss deeper, more knowing, carrying the weight of choice rather than circumstance. When they parted, Eleanor felt as if they had somehow married each other all over again, this time with complete honesty between them. What happens now? She asked, settling back in her chair, but keeping his hands clasped in hers. Now we write the next chapter of this house's story, Aldric said. Together, with no secrets between us and all the time in the world to build something worthy of the love that brought us here. Eleanor looked around Sarah's solar, seeing it now not as a shrine to another woman's happiness, but as the beginning of her own. The dress hanging in the wardrobe, Thomas's gift, worn for their wedding, would serve once more, but this time to celebrate a union built on choice rather than desperation. I want to renew our vows, she said suddenly. Here, in the garden, with the whole village as witness. I want everyone to know that Lady Eleanor Thornwick chose her husband with full knowledge and an open heart. Aldric's smile was radiant. When? Soon. Before autumn truly settles in. I want our new beginning to start while the world still holds the promise of spring. Outside the solar's windows, the garden stretched toward a horizon bright with possibility. Eleanor felt the last of her anger dissolve, replaced by something far more powerful: hope, love, and the unshakable conviction that some stories are worth the complications that make them real. The second wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the manor's restored garden, beneath an archway twined with late-blooming roses and ivy. Eleanor wore her preserved wedding dress, Thomas's gift transformed for a new beginning, but she had added something that made it entirely her own. A blue sash made from fabric salvaged from Sarah's gowns, with Aldric's blessing and careful hands helping with the delicate work. Father Benedict stood ready with his warm Bible. At this time, the entire village had come to witness the ceremony. Word had spread, as it does in small communities, that Sir Aldric and his bride wished to renew their vows with proper celebration. What the villagers didn't know, and what Eleanor and Aldric had decided they didn't need to know, was the full complexity of the story that had brought them to this moment. Eleanor stood at her chamber window, watching the guests gather in the garden below. Mrs. Cotter directed the arrangement of tables, laden with food contributed by various households. Tom Cotter and several other men were hanging lanterns from tree branches, preparing for an evening celebration that would last well past sunset. Children ran between the adults, their laughter echoing off the manor's ancient stones. "There. Happy for us," Aldric said, appearing beside her at the window. He wore his finest clothes, a deep blue coat that complemented her dress, and boots polished to a mirror shine. But it was the expression in his eyes that made Eleanor's breath catch joy tempered with reverence, as if he could hardly believe this moment was real. "They are," Eleanor agreed, watching Mrs. Cotter fuss over the placement of wildflower arrangements. "I never expected such acceptance." "You underestimate your effect on people." Aldric touched her hand gently. "You've brought life back to this place in ways that extend far beyond our household." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the changes that had occurred since her arrival. She had indeed become the village's unofficial counselor, offering advice to young wives and comfort to grieving widows. Her skill with needle and thread had been called upon to mend everything from children's torn clothing to the church's altar linens. Without conscious effort, she had woven herself into the fabric of the community. "Are you ready?" Aldric asked. Offering his arm, Eleanor took a final look around the chamber that had become truly theirs, the bed they shared each night, the writing desk where they composed letters together, the bookshelf that now held both Aldric's poetry and her own journal. This room had witnessed their journey from strangers to friends to something deeper and more complex. "I'm ready," she said, slipping her hand through his elbow. They descended the stairs together, emerging into the garden to find the assembled villagers breaking into spontaneous applause. Eleanor felt tears threaten at the warmth of their reception, but they were happy tears, the kind that come when one realizes how far they have traveled from despair to joy. Father Benedict beamed at them both. "My dear friends," he said, his voice carrying easily through the garden, "we gather today not because these two souls need the church's blessing. They are already wed in the eyes of God, but because love deserves celebration, commitment deserves witness, and joy deserves to be shared." Eleanor and Aldric took their places before the priest, but this time everything felt different. Where their first ceremony had been born of desperation and necessity, this one grew from choice and certainty. Eleanor looked out at the faces surrounding them, people who had become neighbors, friends, even family in the space of a few months, and felt the deep satisfaction of belonging somewhere. "Sir Aldric," Father Benedict said with gentle formality, "do you take Eleanor to be your wife, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Aldric replied, his voice strong and clear. "Before God and these witnesses, I choose Eleanor as my partner, my equal, my beloved companion on whatever journey lies ahead." "Lady Eleanor," the priest continued, "do you take Aldric to be your husband, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" Eleanor felt the weight of the moment, the significance of choosing love over fear, hope over safety, connection over solitude. "I do," she said, her voice carrying across the garden like a bell. "Before God and these witnesses, I choose Aldric as my partner, my protector, my dearest friend and greatest love." When they exchanged rings, the same sapphire band Eleanor now wore permanently, and a new gold band she had commissioned for Aldric. Their hands were steady, their hearts certain. The rings caught the afternoon light like captured promises, symbols of commitment freely given rather than desperately seized. "By the power vested in me by God and the Church of England," Father Benedict declared, his voice rich with satisfaction, "I pronounce you husband and wife, now and always. Sir Aldric, you may kiss your bride." This kiss was different from both their hasty first ceremony and their gentle reconciliation in Sarah's solar. This kiss spoke of choice and joy, of two people who had found each other against all odds and decided to build a life together. When they parted, the garden erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. What followed was perhaps the most joyous celebration Thornwick Manor had seen in decades. Tables groaned under the weight of food, prepared by generous neighbors. Musicians appeared with fiddles and drums, filling the air with melodies that had the children dancing and the adults clapping along. Lanterns cast warm pools of light as evening approached, transforming the garden into something magical. Eleanor found herself pulled from group to group, receiving congratulations and small gifts from people who had opened their hearts to her. Mrs. Cotter pressed a jar of her famous preserves into Eleanor's hands. Young Mary Fletcher, whose torn wedding dress Eleanor had mended, offered a small bouquet of herbs for happiness and fertility. Even the village's most taciturn blacksmith managed a gruff, "Well done, my lady," that made Eleanor beam with pleasure. But it was the moment when she and Aldric danced together for the first time as publicly acknowledged husband and wife that made the evening perfect. The musicians struck up a gentle waltz, and Aldric led her to the center of the garden where space had been cleared for dancing. "No regrets?" he asked quietly as they swayed together, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "None," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "You?" "Only that it took us so long to get here." Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy that made several nearby dancers smile in response. "We got here exactly when we were meant to, not a moment sooner or later." As they danced, Eleanor caught sight of the manor's windows glowing warmly in the lamplight. The house looked alive, welcoming, full of the promise of years to come. This was home now, not just the building, but the community, the connections, the life she and Aldric were building together. When the evening finally wound down and the last guest departed with promises to visit soon, Eleanor and Aldric stood together in their garden, surrounded by the remnants of celebration, but finally, blessedly alone. "Thank you," Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder as they surveyed the scene of their triumph. "For what? For being patient while I learned to trust again. For giving me time to choose happiness instead of merely accepting rescue." Aldric's arm tightened around her waist. "Thank you for staying, for seeing past my mistakes to the man I wanted to be for you." Eleanor turned in his arms, studying the face that had become dearer to her than her own. "And what man is that?" "Your husband," he said simply. "In every way that matters." The kiss that followed sealed more than their renewed vows. It sealed their future, their commitment, not just to love, but to the daily work of building a life worthy of that love. When they finally made their way inside, it was to a home that truly belonged to both of them, ready to write the next chapter of its long and storied existence. The morning after their celebration, Eleanor woke to find Aldric already gone from their bed. Pale autumn light filtered through the chamber windows, and she could hear the sound of activity in the courtyard below, voices calling out, the creak of wagon wheels, the stamp of horses' hooves. For a moment, drowsy and content, she assumed the sounds belonged to villagers cleaning up from the previous evening's festivities. Then she heard Aldric's voice, sharp with authority, and another voice responding, one that made her blood run cold with recognition. She rose quickly, pulling on her wrapper, and moved to the window. In the courtyard below stood the same two magistrates who had pursued her months ago. But this time, they were not alone. A third man in expensive clothing stood with them, his bearing suggesting wealth and authority. Even from her elevated position, Eleanor could see the official documents in his hands. "My lord," one of the magistrates was saying to Aldric, "we apologize for the intrusion, but this matter requires immediate attention. New evidence has come to light regarding the debts of one Thomas Hartwell, and we believe his widow may have information crucial to our investigation." Eleanor's hands gripped the windowsill as she watched Aldric position himself squarely between the men and the manor's entrance. His posture reminded her forcibly that beneath his gentle manner lay a knight trained in defense. "As I informed you, gentlemen, months ago," Aldric replied, his voice carrying the authority of nobility, "Lady Eleanor Thornwick is under my protection. Any business you have with my wife can be conducted through proper legal channels, with advance notice and appropriate representation." "Sir Aldric," the well-dressed stranger interjected, "I fear you may not understand the gravity of the situation. I am Lord Edmund Fairfax, and I have reason to believe your wife possesses property that rightfully belongs to me." Eleanor's heart stopped. Lord Fairfax, the name Thomas had mentioned in his final fevered ravings, the man whose shipping venture had proved fraudulent, whose promises had led to their financial ruin. She had assumed he was beyond reach, having disappeared with his investors' money, but apparently he had emerged from whatever shadows had hidden him. And what property would that be? Aldric asked, his tone dangerous despite its apparent calm. "Thornwick Manor," Fairfax replied smoothly. "You see, Sir Aldric, Thomas Hartwell had no legal right to sell this property. It was pledged as collateral for debts he owed to me, debts that were never satisfied before his untimely death." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. If Fairfax's claim was legitimate, it would invalidate Thomas's sale to Aldric, which would mean, "I'm afraid I must ask for documentation of these alleged debts," Aldric said. "The sale of this property was conducted through proper legal channels, with clear title transferred to me 3 years ago." "Ah, but you see," Fairfax produced a leather portfolio from his coat, "I have recently recovered certain documents from Thomas Hartwell's business associates. Documents that prove this property was encumbered at the time of sale." Eleanor didn't wait to hear more. She dressed quickly in the first clothes she could find and hurried downstairs, her mind racing through the implications of Fairfax's claim. If he could prove Thomas had pledged the manor as collateral, if he could demonstrate that the debts had never been satisfied, then her marriage to Aldric, built as it was on his ownership of this property, could be called into question. She emerged into the courtyard to find the conversation had grown more heated. Aldric's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, while the magistrates looked increasingly uncomfortable with the turn events had taken. "Eleanor," Aldric said as she approached, relief and concern warring in his expression, "Lord Fairfax claims to have documentation regarding Thomas's debts." "Lady Thornwick," Fairfax said with a bow that managed to be both proper and mocking, "how fortuitous that you've chosen to appear. Perhaps you can clarify your late husband's business arrangements." Eleanor studied the man who had been the instrument of Thomas's ruin. Fairfax was perhaps 50, well-groomed and expensively dressed, with the kind of practiced charm that masked a predatory nature. His eyes held no warmth as they assessed her, calculating her worth in the same manner he might evaluate a piece of livestock. "My husband's business arrangements were conducted in good faith," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Unlike yours, my lord." Fairfax's smile sharpened. "Careful, my dear. Accusations require proof, and I'm afraid the only proof available supports my position." He gestured to the documents in his hands. "These papers clearly show that Thornwick Manor was pledged to secure a loan of £1,000. When your husband defaulted on that loan, The property became mine by right. And yet, Eleanor said, stepping closer to examine the papers, I see no signature of my husband's on these documents, because they were signed by his business partner, acting on his behalf. A business partner who, conveniently, disappeared when the shipping venture failed. Eleanor's voice carried a note of steel that made even the magistrates look up sharply. How fortunate that he reappears now, with documents that have somehow survived whatever catastrophe scattered the rest of Thomas's business records. Fairfax's composure cracked slightly. I resent the implication, and I resent the intrusion, Aldric interrupted, moving to stand beside Eleanor. Lord Fairfax, if you believe you have a legitimate claim to this property, you're welcome to pursue it through the courts. But I'll not have my wife harassed on her own doorstep. Sir Aldric, one of the magistrates said uncomfortably, we are bound by law to investigate Lord Fairfax's claims. If these documents prove authentic, then they can be authenticated by proper authorities, Eleanor said firmly. But until such time, this property remains in my husband's possession, and I remain under his protection. She moved closer to Fairfax, studying his face with the intensity of a scholar examining a particularly problematic text. Tell me, my lord, how did you come by these documents? And why did they not surface during the original investigation of Thomas's business affairs? That is hardly relevant. On the contrary, it's entirely relevant. Eleanor's voice gained strength as she recognized the fear flickering behind Fairfax's bluster. These papers, if they are genuine, should have been presented when Thomas's creditors first made their claims. The fact that they appear now, months after his death, suggests either remarkable carelessness on your part or remarkable creativity. Aldric stepped forward, his presence suddenly radiating the authority of a man accustomed to command. Lord Fairfax, I suggest you withdraw these claims voluntarily. I've had considerable experience with fraudulent documents, and I'm prepared to invest significant resources in having these papers thoroughly examined by the finest legal minds in London. The threat was politely worded but unmistakable. Fairfax found himself facing not just a country knight and his wife, but the combined weight of noble authority and financial resources that could make his life very difficult indeed. Furthermore, Eleanor added, her confidence growing as she saw Fairfax's uncertainty, I'm prepared to travel to London myself to testify about your business practices. I believe there are several other investors who would be very interested to learn of your reappearance. Fairfax's face went pale. You have no proof of any wrongdoing, don't I? Eleanor smiled, and there was nothing gentle in the expression. I have Thomas's correspondence, my lord. Every letter he wrote documenting your promises, your failures, your eventual disappearance. I have the testimony of other investors who were ruined by your schemes, and I have the resources of my husband's position to ensure that testimony reaches the proper authorities. The silence that followed was broken only by the shifting of horses and the uncomfortable clearing of throats. From the magistrates, Fairfax looked from Eleanor to Aldric, clearly calculating his chances of success against the united front they presented. This is not finished, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, Eleanor replied quietly, it is. Thomas is dead, my lord. Your schemes died with him. Find some other widow to torment, because this one is beyond your reach. Fairfax retreated to his horse with as much dignity as he could muster, the magistrates following with obvious relief. As the party rode away, Eleanor felt a chapter of her life finally closing, not just Thomas's death, but the fear and uncertainty that had followed it. Well, Aldric said as the dust settled, that was illuminating. Eleanor turned to find him smiling at her with something approaching awe. What? I've just watched my gentle wife transform into a warrior, he said, pulling her into his arms. Remind me never to cross you. Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. I had an excellent teacher in the art of protecting what matters. And what matters to you, Lady Thornwick? Eleanor looked up at the manor's ancient stones, then back at the man who had become her anchor in every storm. This, she said simply. All of this. You, me, the life we're building together. And I'll defend it against anyone who tries to take it away. The kiss that followed tasted of victory, of battles won and peace finally claimed. They had faced their past together and emerged stronger, ready to write whatever came next in their story. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the manor's garden, watching Aldric work with young Tom Fletcher, teaching the baker's son the fundamentals of swordplay. The boy's earnest concentration as he attempted to master the basic positions reminded her of Aldric's own transformation from reclusive knight to patient mentor. 3 other village lads waited their turn, wooden practice swords in hand, there, faces bright with admiration for the man who had once been known simply as the Hermit of Thornwick Manor. Remember, Aldric called out as Tom lunged forward with more enthusiasm than technique. A sword is not a club. The blade does the work. Your job is to guide it with precision, not force. Eleanor smiled, one hand resting unconsciously on the subtle swell of her belly where their child grew beneath her heart. The pregnancy had been a surprise, discovered only 3 weeks past when the village midwife confirmed what Eleanor had begun to suspect. The news had transformed Aldric from devoted husband to protective guardian, fussing over her health with an intensity that was both endearing and occasionally exasperating. My lady? Mrs. Cotter's voice interrupted her reverie. The baker's wife approached with a basket of fresh bread and the broad smile that had become a fixture whenever she visited the manor. I've brought the weekly delivery, and Tom wanted me to ask, might Sir Aldric have time to examine that old sword we found in our attic? I'm certain he would be delighted, Eleanor replied, accepting the warm loaves with gratitude. He's become quite the expert on identifying historical weapons. It was true. Word of Aldric's knowledge had spread beyond the village, drawing visitors from neighboring parishes and even occasional scholars from London universities. The manor that had once stood empty and unwelcoming now frequently hosted guests seeking expertise on medieval artifacts or simply hoping to hear the stories of a knight who had lived through transitional times in England's history. And how are you feeling, my lady? Mrs. Cotter asked with the gentle concern that every village woman extended to expectant mothers. No more morning sickness? Much better, thank you. Eleanor had discovered that pregnancy agreed with her remarkably well once the initial weeks of queasiness had passed. I'm told I'm glowing, though I suspect that may be the charitable interpretation of looking perpetually warm. Mrs. Cotter laughed. You are indeed glowing, my lady. Marriage and motherhood suit you well. As the woman departed, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed since that stormy night when she first sought shelter beneath the garden archway. The archway itself had been rebuilt, not from necessity, but from desire to mark the transformation of their lives. Where once a weathered stone entrance had provided reluctant sanctuary, now a graceful arch twined with climbing roses welcomed visitors to a home that had become the heart of the community. The manor itself bore little resemblance to the neglected pile she had first encountered. Room by room, she and Aldric had restored beauty to the ancient house. Tapestries hung clean and bright on the walls. Furniture gleamed with careful polishing. Gardens bloomed with flowers that attracted neighbors, seeking both practical advice and simple pleasure in shared beauty. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. Aldric had emerged from his self-imposed isolation to become not just a neighbor, but a leader teaching the young men defensive skills, advising farmers on land management, serving as an informal magistrate for minor disputes. His transformation, from broken recluse to respected patriarch, had been gradual but undeniable. Eleanor's own role had evolved equally dramatically. She had become the village's unofficial counselor, the woman others sought when life presented challenges that required both practical wisdom and emotional support. Her skills with needle and thread had expanded into teaching other women the fine arts of mending and embroidery. Her experience with loss and recovery had made her a source of comfort for those facing their own trials. Eleanor? Aldric's voice drew her attention back to the present. The short lesson had concluded, and the boys were departing with promises to practice the techniques they had learned. "You look thoughtful." "I was remembering," she said, accepting his offered arm as they strolled toward the house. "Thinking about how different everything is now. Regrets?" Eleanor paused to consider the question seriously, as she always did. When Aldric asked it, "None? You?" "Only that it took us so long to find each other." They had reached the new garden gate, Aldric's latest project, a beautifully crafted entrance that replaced the old archway where Eleanor had first collapsed in desperation. The gate stood open in permanent welcome, its iron scrollwork depicting roses and oak leaves, symbols of love and strength intertwined. "I've been thinking about names," Eleanor said as they passed through the gate. "For the baby." Aldric's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "And what have you decided?" "For a girl, I thought perhaps Sarah Eleanor, honoring both the woman who made this house a home before me and my own journey to belonging." "Sarah would be pleased," Aldric said softly. "And for a boy? Thomas Aldric?" Eleanor felt rather than saw her husband's surprise. "I want our son to carry the names of both the men who shaped our story. The one who built the foundation of love in this house, and the one who restored it." Aldric stopped walking, turning to face her with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Eleanor, are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything." Eleanor reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the familiar warmth that had become her anchor. "This child was conceived in love, nurtured by hope, and will be born into a home where the past and present exist in harmony. What better way to honor that than with names that celebrate our whole story?" "I love you," Aldric said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything they had shared and everything yet to come. "And I love you," Eleanor replied. "All of you, the knight you were, the man you are, the father you will become." As they resumed their walk toward the manor, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of a life fully lived. She had survived loss, overcome desperation, faced down those who would exploit her vulnerability, and emerged stronger than she had ever imagined possible. More than that, she had found love, not the desperate clinging of two drowning souls, but the steady partnership of two people who had chosen to build something beautiful together. The manor rose before them, its windows glowing warm in the afternoon light. Soon those windows would reflect the laughter of children, the conversations of friends, the daily business of a family that had learned to transform even the most broken foundations into something worthy of celebration. Eleanor felt the baby stir within her, as if responding to her thoughts of the future. This child would grow up in a house filled with love, surrounded by a community that valued both individual strength and mutual support. The storms that had driven Eleanor to Thornwick Manor were long past, but the shelter they had led her to would endure for generations to come. "Come inside now," Aldric said with gentle humor, echoing the words that had changed both their lives. "Our home is waiting." Eleanor smiled and followed her husband through the door of the house that had become their sanctuary, their partnership, their legacy. Behind them, the garden gate stood open to whatever travelers might seek shelter from life's storms. Ahead lay the endless possibility of days filled with purpose, nights wrapped in contentment, and the quiet joy of love that had been chosen freely and cherished completely. The story that had begun with a desperate woman seeking shelter had become something far greater, a testament to the power of mercy, the strength found in vulnerability, and the way two broken hearts could heal each other into something more beautiful than either had ever been alone. It was, Eleanor thought as she settled into the chair by the fire where Aldric first offered her sanctuary. Exactly the story this house had always been meant to tell.